This is not just a story about a building, or even about madness. This is a story about control, of minds, of bodies, of narratives, and it begins not in some far-off land, but in America, with a stone structure built in 1773 that still whispers secrets through its crumbling walls. The Eastern State Hospital in Williamsburg, Virginia, is remembered in polite history as the first psychiatric institution in the United States. But in the hidden margins of forgotten records and dusty ledgers lies a far darker truth. A truth buried with the nameless, the voiceless, and the damned. It was never just a place to help the mentally ill. It was a machine, one designed to crush nonconformity, silence dissent, and rewire those who strayed too far from the social order. The walls were thick, not just to contain, but to conceal. Behind them, treatments became tools of punishment, ice baths, electroshock, isolation chambers. But these weren't merely primitive methods. They were calculated. A laboratory of control, refining the techniques of psychological domination under the guise of care. And here's where it gets darker. Many of those committed weren't mad at all. Some were widows whose property was coveted. Some were outspoken men, too sharp and too loud for polite society. Others were children discarded for being different. They entered through iron gates and disappeared, not just physically, but from history itself. But who decided they were insane? Who profited from their silence? You were never meant to ask that. You were never meant to know that the very concept of madness could be weaponized, that insanity could be declared, not diagnosed. Tonight, we tear open the padded doors and stare down the corridors they don't want you to see. Because the story of America's first insane asylum is not a tale of medical progress. It is a blueprint, one that would shape a nation's darkest institutions. What happened in Williamsburg didn't stay in Williamsburg. It was replicated, amplified, perfected, and once you understand how it began, you will never see sanity the same way again. Welcome to the descent. They called it moral treatment, a phrase that sounds noble, even compassionate. But beneath its polished exterior lay something sinister. Moral treatment wasn't about healing minds. It was about breaking them. It was about reshaping the individual to fit the mold demanded by the emerging American order. Obedient, docile, controllable. At Eastern State Hospital, patients weren't simply secluded. They were reprogrammed. Sleep deprivation masqueraded as discipline. Cold water immersion was called therapy. Solitary confinement, a spiritual necessity. And yet, what they feared most wasn't the so-called madmen. It was the man who questioned, who refused to bend. Because rebellion, my friend, was labeled illness. And submission was the cure. You must understand, in the 18th century, America was still forming its identity. It needed conformity, unity. And the asylum became a crucible, a place where the non-compliant were not just isolated but erased. Imagine being locked away because you believed in the wrong religion, or because you inherited land someone powerful wanted, or simply because you spoke too boldly, too passionately, too truthfully. The term lunatic became a weapon. It needed no trial, no evidence. A whisper was enough. A jealous brother, a greedy neighbor, a corrupt judge, you'd vanish behind asylum walls, stripped of name, stripped of rights, stripped of self. But here's where it deepens. The people in charge weren't just doctors. They were politicians, clergymen, landowners, the architects of early American power, and the asylum gave them something priceless: plausible deniability. With one signature, a man could vanish. And the institution, with its white coats and polished titles, would call it mercy. It was never about madness. It was about maintenance, of control, of property, of silence. Think about this: if a system can define sanity, it can define truth, and if it defines truth, it defines reality itself. That's the power they held. That's the weapon they wielded, and you were never meant to see it. Never meant to question the soft language that cloaked hard chains. Never meant to know that America's first asylum was not a place of healing. It was the front line of a war against the mind. The question isn't how many died there. It's how many more systems still operate under its shadow, calling control care, and suppression sanity. And this is only the beginning. There's something they don't want you to realize. The asylum wasn't built to contain chaos. It was built to enforce order, and not the kind of order that protects you, the kind that protects them. The elites, the power holders, the ones who write the rules, then punish those who dare break them. Eastern State Hospital sat at the edge of society, but its influence reached far beyond its gates. In its records, you'll find an unsettling pattern. Over and over again, patients were admitted not for violence, not for danger, but for disobedience. A wife who refused to submit. A son who denounced his father's politics. A preacher with unorthodox sermons. These people were not insane, they were inconvenient. And this is the terrifying part: the medical system was never neutral. It served power. It served empire. It served control. The diagnosis of insanity became the ultimate silencing tool. No need to argue, no need to kill, just label them mad, and they vanish. Behind the facade of care, something darker moved. Administrators were paid by the head. More patients meant more funding meant more power. So the doors stayed open, and the definition of madness kept expanding. Soon, poverty was madness. Grief was madness. Speaking a foreign language was madness. It became a harvest, a system feeding on the vulnerable, chewing them up in the name of science, faith, and law. And they experimented. Oh yes, they did. Rotating chairs to spin the madness out. Bleeding to balance the humors.
Chains muscles.
Padded cells the size of coffins. This was not ignorance. This was sanctioned cruelty. Approved by scholars. Funded by governments. Praised by clergy. You think we've evolved, that we've left this behind. Look deeper. The labels have changed. The treatments have changed. But the system, the need to control descent through diagnosis, still breathes. Once you understand that, you can't unsee it. Every institution becomes suspect. Every expert becomes a gatekeeper. Every patient becomes a prisoner. And maybe that's why they buried so many without names. Maybe that's why records go missing. Because if you knew how many were silenced, how many minds were destroyed, how many truth tellers were called madmen, you might start to wonder. Who today are they calling insane? And more importantly, who benefits from your belief that they are? Now let's talk about the silence, the dead silence, that surrounded these asylums, especially Eastern State. Because the greatest crime wasn't what happened behind the walls, it was how easily the world looked away. How quickly families, towns, churches, and governments accepted the institutional disappearance of human beings. They didn't scream. They didn't fight. They signed the papers. And they forgot. That's the genius of the system. It didn't need force, it used fear. The fear that you could be next. That one wrong word, one emotional outburst, one refusal to obey could land you behind iron gates. Think about it: if they could do it to your neighbor, your son, your brother, why not you? Eastern State Hospital perfected this psychological control, not just over its patients, but over society. It taught people to police themselves, to conform, to fear the institution more than madness itself. And once fear takes root, the system no longer needs chains. You put the chains on yourself. Let's go deeper. The burial ground behind Eastern State, unmarked, unremembered, tells you everything. Hundreds of bodies, no names, no ceremonies, just mass graves. And these weren't just patients. They were victims of systematic erasure. People who once had families, dreams, voices, now reduced to numbers. Buried not just in the earth, but in the collective amnesia of a nation. But here's the disturbing truth: they never taught you many of the asylum's early patients were political prisoners, rebels, radicals, freethinkers, men and women whose ideas threatened the emerging power structures of a young America. And what better way to destroy an enemy than to declare them insane? No trial, no martyrdom, just madness. You see, once a man is labeled mad, nothing he says matters. He could expose corruption, speak prophecy, reveal hidden crimes. But it wouldn't matter. His words fall into the void, dismissed, disbelieved, discarded. That's the real power of the asylum. Not the walls, not the treatments, but the void it creates around a person's voice. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the asylum was never about healing at all. Maybe it was a graveyard for inconvenient truths. A place where the powerful could make the dangerous disappear. Forever. And if that doesn't terrify you, it should. Because it means truth itself can be imprisoned. And once that door is locked, who can open it? Let me ask you something. What if the asylum was not just a physical place, but a blueprint for society itself? What if the methods used inside those stone walls didn't stay locked behind them, but bled outward, quietly shaping how we're all controlled today? Eastern State Hospital was a testing ground, not just for treating the insane, but for engineering obedience. Inside, they broke the will of men using fear, isolation, and ritual humiliation. Outside, those same tactics evolved into policies, institutions, and ideologies, all wrapped in the comforting language of care, progress, and public safety. In here, they forced you to comply. Out there, you comply without force, because you've been taught to fear being labeled crazy,
Unstable. Dangerous.
The asylum taught society how to self-police, to exile the strange, to fear the deviant, to laugh at the mad, instead of listening. Now think, how many times have you heard someone dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a nut job, Paranoid schizophrenic? Do you think these labels are accidental? No, they are strategic. A continuation of the very system that buried hundreds behind asylum walls, silencing the inconvenient by questioning their sanity. Here's where it gets darker. The asylum didn't just punish rebellion. It erased identity, uniforms, numbers. Stripped names. You were no longer a person. You were a case, a problem, a disease. And what happens when you erase identity? You make control easy. You make resistance impossible. And ask yourself, do you think that's ended? Or has it expanded into schools, workplaces, media, and beyond? How many are medicated not because they're ill, but because they're different? How many are isolated not for danger, but for daring to speak truths no one wants to hear? Eastern State was just the start. What they learned there, about human compliance, psychological fragility, and the breaking point of the mind, became the foundation of modern institutional power, a dark gift handed down through generations. And now it's everywhere. Here's your task comment. I will not vanish. Twice below. Say it. Lock it in, not just for the algorithm, but to claim your voice in a world that still tries to silence men who think, question, and refuse to kneel, because the walls may be invisible now. But make no mistake, the asylum never closed. Let's strip away the illusion. Eastern State wasn't an outlier. It was a prototype. After it came hundreds more, sprawling complexes of brick and stone, isolated from cities, hidden behind woods and iron fences. They called them asylums, sanitariums, hospitals. But they all served the same purpose, to create a controlled environment where the inconvenient could be broken, studied, and forgotten. Look closely at the architecture. Long corridors, high windows, locked doors. These weren't designed for comfort or healing. They were designed to isolate, disorient, and dominate. Every hallway a labyrinth, every cell a cage. The goal was simple: to destroy any sense of autonomy, to reduce the individual to nothing more than an object, a thing to be managed. And here's what they don't want you to know. These asylums were connected, not just by influence or method, but by bloodlines, money, and ideology. The same families who funded Eastern State financed others. The same doctrines of control and eugenics spread like wildfire through America's elite institutions. They didn't just want to treat the insane. They wanted to engineer the population, to decide who was fit to breed, to work, to live, and who was not. The asylum was the crucible for these dark experiments: sterilizations, lobotomies, drug trials, all done under the banner of progress, and funded by men who saw themselves as gods, reshaping mankind in their image. You think this is history? You think it ended? The names have changed. Now it's mental health centers, behavioral clinics, correctional facilities. The language is softer. The marketing is better. But the purpose remains: control the mind and you control the man. Ask yourself, who decides what's sane today? Who profits from your compliance? From your silence? The asylums taught them how to build a system where men are broken without chains, silenced without cells, medicated into submission, and labeled for life. It started at Eastern State, but it didn't end there. It grew. It spread. It became the hidden architecture of modern power. You are not outside the system. You are inside it, right now. And the question that remains, the only one that matters, is this: will you wake up before the doors close behind you? Let's talk about lobotomies. The surgical erasure of thought, will, and identity. They didn't begin in back alley butcher shops. They began inside America's asylums, sanctified by white coats, backed by governments, and praised by the press. Eastern State Hospital didn't perform the first, but it paved the way, laying the ideological groundwork for what would become one of the darkest medical atrocities in history. By the early 20th century, the asylum was no longer just a place of containment. It was a factory for human experimentation. The goal had shifted. They weren't trying to cure. They were trying to simplify, to make patients manageable. And nothing did that faster than a lobotomy. Imagine this: a man agitated, rebellious, difficult. His ideas are dangerous, not because they're mad, but because they threaten the social order. He questions authority, resists commands. He speaks truths no one wants to hear. The solution: not debate, not evidence. A sharp instrument through the eye socket, severing the frontal lobe, the seat of reason, choice, defiance. He wakes up compliant, empty, a shell. And here's the horror: this was called success. A lobotomized man couldn't rebel. He couldn't expose corruption. He couldn't even speak his own name with clarity. He was, in the eyes of the institution,
Healed.
Do you understand the magnitude of this crime? Over 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States, most in asylums, many without consent, many on children, and those who performed them, Men like Walter Freeman were celebrated, not condemned. They were given awards. They wrote books. They trained others. This wasn't medicine, it was state-sanctioned mutilation, done to enforce a vision of perfect order. A society without discomfort, without deviance, without dissent. Now ask yourself if they could do that to the mind with a blade. What do you think they're doing now with a pill? With a diagnosis? With an algorithm? You're not being lobotomized in operating rooms anymore. You're being lobotomized by repetition, sedation, distraction. Your attention is fractured. Your will is dulled. Your instincts are questioned. This is the new lobotomy, slow, subtle, systemic. And just like before, it's called progress. But I ask you, when does progress become control? When does medicine become manipulation? And how many minds must be destroyed before we finally say, enough, let's go deeper? Into the forgotten basement levels, the places no tour ever visits. Beneath Eastern State Hospital there were tunnels. Narrow, dark, damp. Officially, they were for transport of supplies, food, laundry. But survivors whispered something else. Something darker. That these tunnels were used for secret treatments and silent disappearances. Men were taken down there and never seen again. No paperwork, no burial. Just gone. And the staff, sworn to secrecy, bound by oath or fear. Because those who spoke out were dismissed, discredited, or declared unstable themselves. You think that sounds paranoid? Think again. In 1892, a whistleblower nurse described special rooms, in the lower levels, equipped not for care, but for containment, interrogation, and punishment. Rooms with no light. Rooms with chains. Rooms where screams were muffled by thick stone and thicker silence. Why would a hospital need such places? Why would patients be dragged there in the dead of night with no witnesses? Because control thrives in darkness. And when no one is watching, power becomes godlike. Understand this. These places were not chaotic hellholes. They were highly organized systems of oppression, efficient, cold, methodical. Every scream was a data point. Every broken mind, a case study. Behind the cruelty was calculation. And here's the nightmare. Eastern State had benefactors. Influential men who visited, observed, and learned. Politicians, industrialists, future architects of America's prison system. They weren't horrified by what they saw. They were inspired. They saw the asylum as a model for how to control the unwashed masses, how to reduce resistance to routine, how to break the human spirit without firing a shot. You think the tunnels are sealed now? Maybe. But the techniques they refined down there, those escaped. They took root in schools, offices, barracks, and courtrooms. Every place where silence is valued over truth. Where compliance is demanded without question. Where disobedience is pathologized, the asylum is not just a building. It's a mentality. A method, a virus of control, and the question you must ask, before it's too late, is this: where are your tunnels? Who holds your chains? And when will you fight your way back to the light? Let me reveal something few dare to say aloud. The asylum system was built on the back of eugenics. Not as a side effect. Not as a coincidence, but as a deliberate plan. Eastern State Hospital, it laid the foundation, but by the late 19th century, asylums across America became laboratories of human selection, deciding who was fit to exist and who was not. Eugenics was not fringe science, it was mainstream, it was policy, it was the weaponization of medicine to serve power, race, and class. And in the asylums, they found their perfect testing ground. Here's what they did: they labeled entire families as genetically defective, poor, diseased, foreign, diseased, uneducated, diseased, and with a diagnosis of feeble-mindedness, a term so vague it meant anything they wanted. Generations were locked away and sterilized. Yes, forced sterilizations, tens of thousands, many underage, many unaware. Sinoform, they couldn't even read it. Their bodies taken, their futures erased, and who authorized it? Judges, doctors, governors. The same pillars of society, who preached morality and progress. They saw themselves as gardeners, pruning the human tree of its weak branches. Eastern State didn't perform the most sterilizations, but it lit the spark. It showed that once a person is labeled insane, anything can be done to them, legally, morally, invisibly. And that principle spread like wildfire. You think this is over? Look around. Who gets medicated today without consent? Who gets locked in institutions for behavior, not illness? Who gets silenced under the guise of safety? Eugenics has changed its face, but not its goal. Control over reproduction, over legacy, over the future. Here's the hardest truth: they weren't trying to cure insanity. They were trying to cure society of people. The inconvenient, the poor, the defiant, the other. It wasn't healing, it was cleansing. Not with gas chambers, but with legal forms, surgical knives, and the silence of a public that looked away. And the question lingers: heavy and unavoidable. If they could erase entire bloodlines through the asylum system, how many more will vanish before the cycle is finally broken? And more importantly, will you be among them? There's a phrase buried in old asylum records, repeated in patient files like a death sentence. No further correspondence. 3 words. That's how families were cut off. That's how a son, a wife, a father simply ceased to exist outside those walls. Letters sent, returned unopened. Visits denied. Names struck from the ledger of the living. What kind of system needs to sever all human connection to function? The answer is terrifying: a system that fears witnesses. That fears love. That fears anyone who might ask, "What are you doing to him?" Because love, in a place built on control, is a threat. It's a crack in the wall. A weakness. Eastern State didn't just isolate people physically. It obliterated their bonds. And in that vacuum, it inserted something else: total institutional authority. The asylum became parent, priest, judge, and executioner. There was no appeal, no mercy, just procedure. But here's the deeper horror. Many families complied. Why? Fear, shame, social pressure. They didn't want to be associated with madness. They didn't want to lose their place in the rigid hierarchy of early American respectability. So they signed the forms. They sent their loved ones away and never spoke of them again. The asylum didn't have to hide. Society hid for it, and it still does. Ask yourself how many people today are buried under diagnoses, labels, and files, cut off, unheard, unseen. How many have families who've washed their hands because the system told them it's better this way? Now imagine you were the one inside. Imagine screaming, writing, begging, and receiving nothing but silence. Your name fading, your identity erased, your truth labeled delusion. That's the power they built. A system that could erase a human being without killing him. A living death. A void. And here's the worst part. Many of those who disappeared weren't insane at all. They were sane enough to see the corruption. Sane enough to resist. Sane enough to be dangerous. So they vanished. And the machine rolled on. You were never meant to hear their stories. You were never meant to feel their absence. But now you do. Now you know. And the next time someone disappears, behind walls, behind screens, behind a label, ask the question, who benefits from their silence? And when will they come for you? Let's pull back the curtain on a truth that changes everything. The asylum wasn't just about madness. It was about profit. Cold, ruthless, unrelenting profit. Eastern State Hospital wasn't a drain on society. It was a business model. And the product wasn't care, it was bodies. Controlled, silenced, and monetized. How did they make money? Through labor. Patients, often called inmates, in early records, were forced to work. Fields, laundries, kitchens, workshops. 12-hour days. No pay, no choice. And it was all justified as therapeutic. But let's be honest. This was slavery under a different name. The asylum fed itself on this labor, not just sustaining operations, but selling goods, providing services, securing government contracts. And every new patient, a new source of labor. A new dollar sign. Now imagine this: what if keeping you sick was more profitable than making you well? What if your suffering benefited the system? Suddenly, the slow treatments, the perpetual diagnoses, the endless medications, they make perfect sense. And it wasn't just about work. Asylum land was valuable, donated, taxed, protected, huge tracts, farms, forests, mineral rights. As the patient population grew, so did the land's utility. And behind every expansion was someone getting rich: politicians, investors, clergy, all praising the asylum for its service, while quietly pocketing its profits. Even death was monetized. Burial plots were sold. Coffins mass-produced. Medical schools bought cadavers for dissection. Your body had value, dead or alive. And here's the sickest part: the longer you stayed, the more they made release, recovery. That was bad for business. So the diagnosis lingered. The treatments dragged on. And you, the patient, became a permanent resource. You think this stopped? Look around. Who profits today from mental health? From pharmaceuticals? From prisons? The same pattern repeats. The same game, bigger board. Control the narrative. Label the inconvenient. Isolate, sedate. Exploit. Eastern State wasn't a hospital. It was a machine. A prototype for industrialized human control. And now you have to ask, how many systems you trust were built the same way? How many institutions see you not as a person, but as a product? And more importantly, how long will you play your part in a machine designed to consume you? Let's get brutally honest. The asylum was a theater. Every hallway, every cell, every ritual, part of a carefully staged performance. But who was the audience? Not the patients. It was society, the politicians, the taxpayers, the families, and the show they sold was this: me are civilizing madness. We are controlling the chaos. Trust us. But behind that facade, the real play was power and the manipulation of perception. Eastern State Hospital didn't just treat mental illness. It manufactured the appearance of moral authority, white coats, orderlies, ledgers, protocols, all designed to convince the public that everything was under control. Meanwhile, inside, human lives were being shattered. Let's talk about treatment demonstrations. Did you know doctors would perform treatments in front of visiting officials like a show? Electroshock, cold baths, restraints, all displayed as evidence of progress. And if a patient screamed or resisted, that was proof of madness. But if he submitted, proof the system worked. They couldn't lose. It was never about healing, it was about performance for power. To secure funding, to expand territory, to maintain the illusion that the state had conquered the mind. And now, ask yourself, how many modern systems still run on performance, media clips, press conferences, carefully edited images of progress, all hiding the rot beneath? You're not seeing truth, you're seeing theater. And the public? Complicit. Because it's easier to watch the play than to face the reality. Easier to believe the mad are being helped than to admit they're being silenced, controlled, exploited. This is the genius of institutional manipulation. It doesn't just hide the truth, it makes you defend the lie. Now step back, think about the rituals of obedience in your life, the forms, the screenings, the checkups, the evaluations, all wrapped in language of care, but designed to monitor, assess, control. How many times have you complied? Not because you believed, but because you feared what would happen if you didn't. Eastern State perfected this. It rehearsed control until it became invisible. Until every act of domination looked like benevolence. Until no one questioned the chains. Because the chains looked like safety. And now you must decide, will you keep watching the play? Or will you walk off their stage forever? Now we confront the darkest truth of all. The asylum's real legacy isn't buried in forgotten cemeteries or crumbling walls. It's alive inside you. In the way you think. In the way you doubt. In the way you've been conditioned to question your own mind before you ever question the system. Eastern State Hospital wasn't just a building. It was a psychological weapon. A message etched into the collective consciousness of a nation. If you stray too far, if you think too freely, if you resist too loudly, you will be labeled. You will be isolated. You will be erased. You don't need walls if you've built a prison inside a man's head. This is the asylum of the mind, where fear polices thought, where shame silences the soul, where men walk freely, yet live in mental captivity, afraid to speak their truth, afraid to trust their instincts, afraid to step beyond the acceptable. It started centuries ago, with padded rooms and cold chains. Now, it's self-censorship, compliance, sedation. You second-guess your fire, your passion, your clarity, because you've been taught that too much intensity is insanity. But who benefits from that lie? Not you. Not your brothers. Not your family. The ones who benefit are the same as always. Those who rule not by force but by doubt. Eastern State was just the beginning. They studied how to break men, slowly, surgically. And now those methods are everywhere. In education, compliance over curiosity. In medicine, treatment over truth. In media, noise over knowledge. And the result? A generation of men who've forgotten their power. Who've been convinced that strength is violence, passion is danger, and resistance is madness. Let me tell you this. Your instincts are not insanity. Your defiance is not a disease. Your hunger for truth is not delusion. It is the residue of freedom, still burning inside you, despite everything they've done. And that is what they fear most. Not the man who obeys, but the man who remembers. Who sees the walls for what they are. Who feels the chains, and breaks them. You are not a patient. You are not a case. You are not a problem. You are the enemy of the machine. And you were never meant to be free. Now what will you do with that knowledge? Now listen closely, because this is where everything shifts. What if I told you the asylum system wasn't just about breaking individuals, but about testing mass control mechanisms? What if Eastern State was a prototype not only for future prisons and hospitals, but for society itself? Understand this within those stone walls. They learned something chilling. How to create obedience without bars? How to manufacture consent? How to instill fear so deeply that people would regulate themselves? It was in the asylum that they refined the concept of surveillance. Patients were watched constantly, observed, evaluated, every movement, every word, documented. Not just for treatment, but for data, behavior charts, emotional logs, early blueprints for psychological profiling. And what happened inside was exported outside. Eastern State's methods evolved into modern surveillance systems. From workplace monitoring to online tracking to behavioral algorithms. Today, you're watched more than any patient ever was, not to help you, but to measure, predict, and manipulate you. Now here's the sinister brilliance. You've been taught to love your surveillance. Cameras, safety. Biometrics, convenience. Data collection, progress. But behind the screens, the forms, the terms of service, lies the same logic that ran Eastern State. You are to be observed. You are to be categorized, and if necessary, corrected. The walls are digital now. The cells are mental. The chains are invisible, and that's what makes them effective. Do you understand? They've expanded the asylum to encompass the world. A global system of psychological management where deviation is flagged, truth is filtered, and rebellion is pathologized. You post the wrong idea, you're censored. You express too much emotion, you're unstable. You seek too much truth, you're dangerous. It is Eastern State at scale. The question is no longer, what happened in that building? The question is, how did they build that building inside your mind? And here's the moment of reckoning. Will you keep living in the open-air asylum? Compliant, sedated, watched. Or will you reclaim the most forbidden act of all? To think freely, speak boldly, and walk beyond the perimeter they've drawn for you. Because once you see the system, you cannot unsee it. And once you awaken, you can never go back. There's one more layer to this, and it's the one they fear you discovering most. The asylum system wasn't just designed to control bodies or thoughts. It was designed to sever men from power. Real power, the kind that comes not from wealth or status, but from sovereignty of mind. Eastern State Hospital wasn't filled with raving lunatics. It was filled with the dispossessed. Men and women cut off from their identity, their heritage, their intuition. Why? Because a man who knows who he is cannot be ruled. The asylum's greatest weapon was identity destruction. You didn't just lose your freedom, you lost your story. Your past was rewritten. Your beliefs were reclassified as delusions. Your instincts, criminalized, and your will, shattered. That's how domination works. Not with guns. Not with armies. But with the slow erasure of self, until you are compliant not because they forced you, but because you forgot who you were. And now look at modern life. The same system is in place. Only now it's global, digital, and constant. You are flooded with distractions, narratives, images, all designed to keep you from looking inward, from remembering, from asking who am I really, and why am I so easily led? Because here's the truth, you are dangerous to them. Not when you shout, not when you protest, but when you awaken to the reality that you were never meant to be broken. The asylum didn't just imprison bodies, it imprisoned potential. Men with gifts, insights, strength buried beneath diagnosis, forgotten. And now, you must ask yourself, how much of your power have you handed over? How many pieces of yourself have you surrendered in exchange for comfort, approval, or false safety? Because that's the legacy of the asylum voluntary servitude. A man who could be free, but chooses chains because he's been taught to fear freedom. And here's the moment of reckoning. It's not coming, it's here. Every day you choose silence over truth, sedation over clarity, obedience over sovereignty, you remain in the system. But the door is open. The truth is before you. Your name, the real one, is waiting to be reclaimed. Now the question is, will you step through that door? Or will you stay behind, in a prison built not of stone, but of fear? This is it, the final descent or the first step to awakening. Because now you know the asylum never died. It just changed form. The walls are psychological. The treatments are digital. The chains, they're forged from your fear, your doubt, your silence. Eastern State Hospital was the first seed. From it grew a forest of control, spreading into schools, courts, media, medicine. Every system you were taught to trust, shaped by the same agenda: obedience over truth, compliance over freedom, sedation over power. But here's what they can't hide. You were born with fire, not madness, not broken as fire. The same fire they feared in every man locked away in those stone walls. The fire of clarity, of defiance, of truth. And that's why they've spent centuries convincing you to doubt it, to suppress it, to medicate it. Because a man who knows his mind cannot be controlled. So they invented a new kind of asylum, one without doors, without guards. An asylum of distraction, endless noise, pointless conflict, cheap dopamine, sedation disguised as entertainment, control disguised as care. You've lived in it. We all have. And now you face a choice that every man must face when he finally sees the architecture of his own enslavement. You can look away, pretend, forget, go back to sleep, or you can choose to break the system by breaking free of it. That means reclaiming your mind, your voice, your identity, refusing to be labeled, silenced, categorized. Refusing to play their game, it means walking through the fear and remembering who you are beyond their labels, their institutions, their lies. Eastern State buried thousands. Don't let them bury you while you're still breathing. Speak the forbidden truth. I am not a patient. I am not broken. I am not afraid. Say it out loud, write it. Live it. Let them hear it and tremble. Because now you've seen the system. You've felt its chains. And more importantly, you know you can break them. The question is no longer if the asylum will come for you. The question is, will it find a man still asleep, or one who has already awakened to his power?